way to travel. If an individual arrives in a country and they declare themselves to the authorities as a refugee, that justifies their having got there illegally, and then they're not subject to penalty. So remember that refugee status, that's a legal status. So you can't be an illegal immigrant if you're a refugee. So although many people do worry that the UK is full, this might be something that you've also heard a lot, and we don't have the resources to help, the UK actually has quite a comparatively very low rate of refugees. So in fact, 80% of all refugees worldwide are hosted in countries neighbouring where they've come from. So this is countries like Turkey, Pakistan and Uganda. So you can see that from that graph on the left. Of the few people that do make it to Europe, a lot of them either stop in their country of first entry, so this is normally Greece or Italy, or they make it to Germany or France. So the UK actually sits fifth on the list of countries with the most asylum applications in Europe, as you can see here. According to UNHCR statistics, at the end of 2018, there were 126,720 refugees in the UK and 45,244 pending asylum cases. So when you compare that with 3.7 million refugees that are believed to be residing in Turkey, so that's compared to that 127,000 in the UK, it pales in comparison. But I should also probably take a step back here and talk about what is actually in Calais. So for any of you who might be joining from the global team and you might not be that familiar, Calais is a town on the very north of the French coast. It's right by the ferry crossing to the UK. And that location by the ferry port is really important. It's the reason that the settlement is where it is. And then actually in Calais, this is the story. So people are living in remarkable conditions. They're in forests, they're in old parking lots, in abandoned warehouses. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that and the conditions that people are living in later. But first, I just want to explain a bit more of the backstory of Calais and why it is that people are settled there and they're living like this, as you can see. So there was a much larger refugee camp that you may know as the Jungle, which encompassed many different nationalities and virtually had its own ecosystem of shops, medical centres and so on inside of it. It was huge. So about 8,000 people are estimated to have been living there by the end. But of course, you get varying statistics depending on who you ask and when they took them. But that was from Help Refugees in 2016. So the refugee camp, it started to develop in Calais in about 1999. It attracted thousands of would-be asylum seekers. They attempted to close it in 2001 and in 2002, but that led to riots. And since then, a lot of migrants have continued to arrive in Calais and they've built makeshift camps near the port. A lot of refugees then have attempted to cross the Channel from France into England through various means. And that issue, it's made British headlines numerous times, as I'm sure a lot of you will have seen, often with less than negative portrayal. So a lot of these events have really heavily influenced British perceptions of refugees, and in a lot of cases, they've hardened general public opinion. That has then in turn led to a tightening of the British refugee regime and a reinforcement of border forces on the French side, which is funded by the UK. So this includes the construction of a almost £2 billion, 1 kilometre long, 4-metre high wall that essentially cut the camp off from the ferry port. And the UK funded this, UK government, so it's taxpayer money. But this obviously just merely pushed people into far less safe conditions. So it just pushes them into the hands of smugglers to try and still make the journey. And then eventually, due to adverse reaction both in the UK and in France, due to the supposed permanence of the camp, the authorities did take action. So this jungle, as it was known, was cleared in October 2016. Lots of the people living there were taken to detention centres or temporary housing, but a lot of people remained and a lot continued to come. So there is still estimated to be between, say, 2,000 and 3,000 people living in makeshift camps or sleeping rough around the area, like that photo you can see on the right that was taken in the woods around Calais. These camps are far less regulated, they're less safe, they have far less resources, and there's just barely any aid that can reach them compared to the regulated camp that existed before. So these camps, basically where there used to be the jungle and people have been kind of pushed further and further out from that area, they've been roughly probably grouped into about 6 different sites over Calais and Dunkirk now. So you can see 4 of the sites here. So it's worth bearing in mind that people don't live sort of directly at a site that is right by those pins that you can see, the blue and yellow ones, but rather that would be a gathering point. So people would be living in various different sort of campsites, just between like a family or two around those areas, and they would congregate where those points are, and that's where we would meet them. So yeah, you can see 4 of them there. There's the main site at the top. That's where the jungle used to be, but there's still sort of like a large amount of people there. Then there were three other sites that we named quite informally, just over what they were close to. So BMX, it was literally near an old BMX track. It was pretty much all Eritreans. Old Lidl, by an old Lidl. It's a very small camp. There's probably only about 20 people there, I reckon, and it was mainly Afghans. And then Afghan hospital, a little bit away from that. It was near Calais' main hospital, and obviously predominantly Afghan population. The jungle, that was a mix of nationalities, to be honest. The one that's at the top is still there now. But mainly I would say it was from a lot of different people from Africa. Most people I spoke to, I'd say, were from Chad or Sudan. Then there's also a lot of people living towards Dunkirk. So we drive out to Dunkirk a couple of days of the week as well. There was a larger site. There was a makeshift camp with tents put up in dilapidated warehouses. It was mainly Kurdish people from Iran and Iraq. And then on the left there, you can see another camp in the forest around a lake it was majority Pakistani people. So why do these people come to Calais in particular? Calais is on the border with the UK. So the refugees there are all attempting to reach the UK across the Channel. They're settled in makeshift camps there with the hope of one day getting across and reaching the UK. However, refugees don't all want to come to the UK. So the idea that the UK is where all refugees try and get to is a common and it's a false misconception. So Sweden and Hungary, for example, which both have much smaller populations than the UK, have taken several times more refugees per head of population than the UK has. The vast majority of refugees arriving in Europe actually end up staying in the first country they arrive in. So this is often Greece or Italy, and they try and settle there. However, Greece and Italy have comparatively less resources, and there's often just overstretched infrastructure and a lack of work opportunities, and it becomes impossible for people to survive there. So I spoke to a lot of people who tried living in other countries, such as Germany or Spain, but they've been waiting years for their refugee application to be heard. So imagine living somewhere for 5 years in a country where you don't know the language, you're not allowed to work, and you're in this constant state of uncertainty. So it's not surprising that after a certain amount of time, people move on and they try to find refuge elsewhere. There are other reasons that refugees are looking to come to the UK. So around half of the people in Calais, they have family ties in the UK, and they're looking to reunite with them. Family ties run deep, so especially when you've lost everything else. Another major reason is language. English is the most widely spoken language in the world, and so as a lot of these people are hoping to work or study, generally contribute to society, it's a lot more practical than, say, living in Slovenia. So a lot of the people that I spoke to, they actually spoke of the UK in really high regard. A lot of them see it as sort of this beacon of democracy, justice, and freedom. And then in comparison to the oppression that a lot of them are fleeing, you can understand why that counts for a lot. And it was quite sort of heartwarming to hear that people's, whether it was right or wrong, to hear people's impressions of the UK in that way. So now a little bit about the organisation that I was actually working with. So they were called Care for Calais. It's a volunteer-run charity. They were delivering essential aid and support to refugees who were just living in the worst conditions all across northern France. They believe in a fair and tolerant British society. They also advocate for a welcoming and inclusive attitude towards refugees generally. So they operate year-round from Calais, and their focus is to provide warm clothing, bedding, food, medical assistance to these people who are in desperate need. In non-COVID times, they also provide social support and interaction, which included language lessons, sport, music workshops, things like that. But during COVID, their operations were far more limited, as you'll see. So a bit of background as to what we as volunteers would do there. So every morning we'd spend time in the warehouse. You can kind of see a little bit in the background of this picture, there's like thousands of cardboard boxes full of donations just stacked up high. So you'd spend time just sorting through them. Just there were ones that like individual people or companies had sometimes sent in, just clothes. We'd make up hygiene packs or food packs, things like that, whatever it was that we could donate. Then in the afternoons, we'd have a briefing. So that's what you can see in this picture here. So we're all gathered round. That's Tia who's presenting to us. She's amazing. She's a 19-year-old volunteer who's been over there for months and is now one of our team leaders. But she would brief us and just sort of say which one of the camps we were going to that day, what it was we were going to distribute. And we generally just sort of like make up an action plan just to make sure everything was done super safely and securely. Everyone knew what was going on. So then the refugees, they all knew the distribution schedule. They'd know where we were going to be. They'd know when we were going to be there. So then they'd form an orderly queue. It's often a few hundred people long. So this is actually from the main site in Calais. So this is where the jungle used to be. There's normally between 200 and 300 people would line up for our distributions there. So during COVID, this became a lot more difficult. So it involved enforcing social distancing measures as best we could. So you can kind of see some markings on the ground there on the left. So this is where we try and sort of space people out in the queue. And then each of us as volunteers, that we'd either be managing the queue, as you can see a couple of people in their high-vis vests there, or we'd be distributing items at the back of the van, which is way in the front of this picture. And then this was the front of the queue. So this is what was going on. You can see we're all like fully PPE'd up just due to the current situation. So some days we'd give out food packs. So you can see this guy on the right, what he's got there, that's not food for one person. It'd be food for his entire sort of campsite, and they would all cook together, because we found that to be a much more sort of economical way of giving food out, because it just meant that people could sort of club together and it worked a lot better. And a lot of them had campfires and sort of cooking equipment, so that's how they would cook with these things. Other times we'd give out hygiene packs or kids packs if there were kids in that campsite. We generally sort of adjust it depending on what the need was and who we knew was going to be there. One thing that we knew that was most in need was shoes. So most of the people here, they've literally walked across 15 countries to get to where they are now. Often they've got the clothes on their back and one pair of shoes and not very much else. So we saw a lot of times people's shoes would be completely sort of flapping open, falling apart. So in this case, what we did, this is while I was there, the charity owner ran an appeal for donations, sort of like monetary donations. And then using that, she ordered a huge amount of trainers that we then gave out. So we did one distribution. This was in Calais main camp, where there's the most need for it. And it was just an incredible reaction. So people were really happy on this day, it was really great to see. And you can hear, there's a few guys here you can see with their new shoes. And then after the distribution session was over, we would just stick around for a few hours. We'd try and create a bit more of a sort of comfortable, safe space and perform a few essential services. So one of these was that we would make masks in line with the WHO regulations. So as you can see there on the right, we'd fold up bits of fabric and secure them with elastic bands, and then we'd give them out to people, just try and raise awareness of the virus and the importance of good hygiene and of wearing masks. So another was first aid. So here on the left, you can see Siobhan. So she was another volunteer. She actually, her day job, she normally diffuses landmines in Cambodia, which is incredible. But she's had to interrupt her training due to Corona, so she had to be back in the UK. But she decided to spend her time coming to Calais instead. And she obviously had very sort of serious first aid training, that being her day job. So she put that to good use here. So she gave us some basic first aid training at one point, and she explained to us something I found really interesting, that she said she finds first aid as a really special opportunity to connect with someone on a level that you don't normally get just through normal conversation. So when people are confiding in you, they're telling you their story, because normally, obviously we were wearing our PPE, we had these big masks on, there's very little sort of like, and you know, there's a language barrier. Sometimes it's very difficult to sort of connect with people and to get their story. But when you're performing first aid on them, they tend to trust you a little bit more. And it was a really nice way of sort of like talking to people and caring for them. But often people's injuries, they were quite shocking. So sometimes there were wounds that people had from being chased by the police, or sometimes, quite often, we saw that there were old torture wounds that people have picked up either in their countries of origin or along their route trying to get from their home country to Europe. So this would often be at the hands of a militia or at the state. Siobhan, the volunteer there that you can see, she said sometimes even if you can't actually physically help someone because this wound is years old and it's healed over and it's just a scar, she said that the best thing you can do is just acknowledge their pain and listen to their story, because they might not have really had that before. And it was a sort of really touching way to look at first aid. So you can see here she's treating a guy's foot. Foot injuries were really common, I think just due to the lack of good shoes, like I was saying before. So it's a really common issue. So these are a couple of the other services that we do. So on the left, you've got bike repair, just so people could get around efficiently. And on the right, there's sewing. So I love sewing for these people, because it was just like a really tangible way to just like momentarily improve someone's day. Like it's so small, and obviously it's doing nothing in terms of the big picture, but just to be able to like fix a hole in someone's jacket and see them sort of smile about it, it was like a really good thing to do. And then often a lot of the guys would sit down with us and they'd help us out and help each other, and it was a really nice way to chat to someone. We also had a barber station. So this, it can be such a sort of human thing just to want to look good and be groomed. It's something that has been shown to also like really improve mental health, just to be able to take care of yourself and take pride in your appearance. It just brings a bit of normality back into these people's lives when they have like very little else. So I spoke to one guy who was really keen to look for sharp for Eid celebration. So he'd been waiting. He was first in line for the barber session before we even got there, and he signed his friend up to come and trim his hair and his beard. So yeah, we would never actually do the hair cutting. I would not trust myself with that. So they would often have their friends who would come and sort of help out, and they'd do it for each other. This guy on the right, his name was Rasco. So he had lived in Spain for a while, but they'd actually never sort of heard his refugee application, so he'd moved on. But he'd managed to learn Spanish while he was there, just by living on the street and just interacting with people. He was Kurdish, and he didn't really speak any English yet, and I don't speak any Kurdish, but we could actually only really communicate through broken Spanish, which was quite interesting. So we were just chatting, we were talking about where we come from, and he got up Google Earth on his phone, and he started to sort of talk about, where he'd been living in Spain and that kind of thing. And he started to sort of zoom in down on his accommodation. And I was expecting to see, like a hostel or something. And he ended up zooming in on a children's playground where he'd been sleeping under the slide. And he was, he was quite sort of like just matter of fact about it, saying, yeah, this is where I slept. And then he pointed next to it and there was a tunnel, and he was like, this is where I slept when it rained. And there was just absolutely no hint of feeling sorry for himself. He was just, happy to be showing me and talking about his story. So it just showed how resourceful these people, and resilient that people can be. He was enduring all of that. He was in a state of legal limbo. He was picking up the language, and then when things didn't work out, he picked himself up. He came here, and now he just couldn't wait to learn English and work in the UK. So you can see here he's just cutting his friend's beard. Now, of course, COVID had a huge effect on life in the camps and on the work that the organisation could carry out. So I arrived at the camps at the beginning of May, which is when lockdown was already well underway, and the knock-on effects were already beginning to be seen. There were much fewer resources due to COVID. State food provision had been reduced by 50%. So at that time, I think all other food providing organisations had actually pulled out of Calais, and the influx of volunteers was severely limited. So this is a video. This is Claire she was the lead of the organisation. She speaks for a couple minutes in this, and I think it explains the situation better than I can. Please shout if you can't hear the sound on this, because I've had a couple of issues earlier, but.
When the coronavirus first arrived in Calais, we were really scared. The conditions that people live in are just the opposite of what you're told to do to protect yourself from this disease. The area that people live in has been fenced off by the French authorities over the last couple of years until they're crammed into a really small area. It's the opposite of social distancing. And there's no running water, and they can't have a shower, never mind wash their hands. So we were really worried. But actually, what's really become apparent is that the real impact, what's hit people the most, is that many NGOs have had to either pull out or scale back their operations, and the French government has reduced the food supply. So food and water shortages, disappearing of basic services like phone charging and medical support, that has been the biggest and most immediate impact. When we try to talk to them about a disease they've never heard of, it doesn't seem as real as the issue of how to feed their children that night. Overnight, we've had to completely change our operation to concentrate 100% on food supply, as this has become the most urgent need. We've had to launch an emergency appeal to fund it because we're spending more money than we've ever done before. But what else can we do? Everything else about our operation has changed as well. We now have 100 new procedures to keep us and the refugees safe. We have to demand social distancing on our distributions. It's incredibly difficult in the conditions in which we operate, but it just wouldn't be right if coming to collect something as necessary as food was putting people at further risk. So we have to ask that they stand 2 metres apart on distributions and maintain that right the way through. It's very difficult, but it's necessary. Now our team is quite small. We used to have 20 or 30 people a day, but now we have just 9. But the volunteers we do have are very special people. Each one has had to make a very significant personal decision to be here right now and do this, and justify that decision to their loved ones as well. We're all taking a big risk to be here, and we've had to come to terms with that. And each person has their own particular...
Just gonna stop that there. But yeah, that gives a little bit of an insight to the way that things were going during COVID. So I think that's starting to sort of alleviate now. But, people are still in desperate need. And so it's had to change the operations of the organisation quite a lot. So now I'm going to show you a few of the things that I saw within the camps. So this, for example, this is an old abandoned warehouse that's in Dunkirk. Previously, there've been hundreds of people living here, just all next to each other in different tents. But now there's just a few scattered tents with people living inside. And I'm going to go into the reasons as to why there's less people there in a minute. So at Dunkirk, so we tended to have different ways of reaching people depending on what the camp was and what the demographic was. So at Dunkirk, it was quite difficult to get the word out about our distributions, just because there were a lot of families living further out into the warehouses, into the woods. They got pushed further and further out there. And so to let them know what we were doing, we would have to go around each of the camps. We would speak to people in their tents or their campsites, and we'd let them know that we're giving out food, and then they would come and collect it from a distribution site. So we'd have like a main point by a warehouse, and they would know we were there. So here we're just walking around the campsites in the forest with a couple of other volunteers. We're just reaching out to people, seeing what new camps had settled since we were there previously, and which ones had moved on. So this is some footage taken from inside the warehouses at Dunkirk. So there's no sound on this one, but so these warehouses, they used to be full of hundreds of people, like I said. They've slowly been decreasing in number just because the police have been coming in, they've been clearing the camps little by little. So that's after pressure from the French government, but also the British government, and they're encouraged to sort of make this as difficult an environment to live in as they possibly can. So normally the site is not that messy. So when there are people living there, it doesn't look like that, obviously. But the police often come along and clear the camps with not very much notice, and they kind of just either tell people to pack up their belongings and go, or the police clear the belongings, or they just sort of take people off to detention centres, and then obviously things like this are left. So yeah, the police, they're often encouraged to come along sort of every 2 or 3 days is what we gathered from when we were talking to people, and they'd come along and clear the camps. They'd forcibly evict anyone who was living there in the impermanent camps. Sometimes they would take them to, during COVID, they would take them to, they had sort of like temporary quarantine centres, which were voluntary, but they would sort of, well, supposedly they were voluntary, but they would quite forcibly take people on sort of big buses and take them there. And then other times they would just confiscate their tents and just expect people to find another place to stay. So, of course, most often these people don't have anywhere else to go. And so they simply have to just get by until organisations like ours could get there and get them another tent to stay in. So as people were trying to avoid the police managing to clear their sites again in sort of more obvious locations, they would push further and further back into the forest. So obviously this was a bit of a disadvantage because it meant it's also further away from where aid can get to them. So these were some of the campsites that we visited in the woods, just as we were out wandering around trying to reach people and let them know about our food and the supply distributions that we were doing. So these pictures in particular, this sort of like panorama here, it was a really moving sight actually. So it was where several families had joined together and they had honestly created this sort of like best kept, well swept campsite I'd ever seen. So there were like chill out areas, there was a cooking stove they'd built up on bricks, there was a line where they'd hung up all the prayer mats that were ready for use. There was like a makeshift broom that they'd made out of wood and twigs, and then on the right, that picture, that's a swing that they'd then built off one of the trees for the kids. So it was a really sort of beautiful sight to people living there. Obviously not ideal circumstances, but yeah. And then it's great to be able to show you all the setting of this and these photos, but like obviously what really matters are the people who are actually living there. So with regards to the demographic of refugees there, just bear in mind that the picture in Calais at the moment, it's not necessarily representative of the global picture of refugees. So although Syrian refugees, they do account for the majority worldwide. The UNHCR estimate there's about 6.7 million Syrian refugees globally at the moment, and I'm sure there are some in Calais. I didn't actually meet any personally. So the majority of the people that we met were from Eritrea, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Chad, Iraq, and Iran. So the majority of people that I met there were men on their own, except for the Kurdish camp, which did have families and children. I've heard a lot of people say that the fact that refugees are often lone men who've left their families must mean that they're not actually genuine refugees. But there's a lot of reasons why they are sort of lone men. So one reason, for example, that a lot of young men come alone is that in countries where they come from, young men can be killed just to stop them from rebelling against the government, like in Sudan. In Eritrea, young men are conscripted for military service for what is effectively a life sentence. And then for all of these reasons, men as young as, say, 13 or 14, they have to run away from their homes and families. Women, children and families, if they're in refugee camps, are also prioritised for humanitarian aid and residents in official camps. So that essentially means that these guys who are left have to make do with the makeshift camps like the ones in Calais. So, for example, I spoke to one guy called Mohammed. I didn't manage to get a picture of him, but he was a Kurdish guy from Iraq. He was 19 and he was in the middle of his university studies when he was in Kurdistan. He was studying Kurdish language and literature. But he'd run into trouble with the paramilitaries for speaking out against the Iraqi government. He'd had to go into hiding, and he was later fleeing the country by foot, and he'd made it all the way to Calais. So, as you can imagine, the patriarchal structure of a lot of societies just means that it's simply less likely that a woman is going to run into those kind of problems and to be persecuted as a result of their political activity, though, of course, it's not impossible. But that does explain why a lot of refugees are male. And then, of course, it's one thing for me to tell you all of this in theory, but I also want to tell you a few personal stories just of people I met and I made friends with while I was in Calais. So, for example, here I am with one of the other volunteers and a guy from Chad named Issa that we became friends with over our time there. So we started chatting to him just because we used to bring this giant speaker to the camps with us so people could plug in their phones and then share music, and it was just like a really sort of fun, safe environment. And Issa sort of immediately ran up to the speaker, he grabbed the aux, and we thought he was going to put on some sort of, yeah, I don't know, local music from Chad, but he started blasting Enrique Iglesias, of all things. He was just saying it's his favourite way to learn English, obviously the English songs, not the Spanish ones. And his dream was just to get to the UK and to study the language and actually figure out what the lyrics meant. So he used to carry around this little pocketbook full of vocabulary, and he'd be writing down all the lyrics, and he'd sort of like ask us, what does this mean? What does this mean? And then this is Issa again. So although he was very young, he was very sort of politically aware. And it was really interesting talking to him. So at one point, this is during the month I was there, a Swedish news broadcaster came and was sort of they recorded a few bits from the camps, and they recorded him speaking. So he's speaking in French, and obviously the subtitles are in Swedish, so I will not be playing the video. But there was a bit of a transcript of what he said, partially here and then partially in another interview that he did. So I'm just going to read out what it was that he said and a bit about his story. So I'm 19 and I'm from Chad. I've had to leave due to political trouble. I was being persecuted. I've now been in Calais for 5 to 6 months. Corona has made things very difficult. We have no way of distancing. If others get ill, so will we. We must queue for everything that we need, and if we leave a space, then we just won't get any. We're scared of the government centres and where we may be taken. Some people have had to go though, as we had so little food in the camp. We were concerned that we'd be fingerprinted in these centres and then not be able to leave. The police are calm at the moment, but when there's a problem, they will hurt anyone and for no reason. They sometimes drive past and they put you in their vans or beat you. They make it difficult for us to get into the UK and sometimes prevent us from accessing our basic needs. There are people crossing by boat because they're tired of being here in these terrible conditions. It's hard to live. Sometimes prison would be better. We're not even treated as humans here. We don't exist. I feel like I'm losing myself. Many people lose their minds here. There are no cars at the moment, so we must go by boat. It's dangerous, but people would rather die than live in these conditions. I would have stayed in France, but my claim was refused. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong and I was doubting myself, but then I found out it happened to a lot of people. And that made me think, as we can't all be doing something wrong. Chad is a French colony, and I thought I could come here and be safe, but in fact we have no rights or freedom. So obviously that's quite a powerful snippet there of his story and of how he interpreted his time in Calais. But slightly more chirpy. So this was a guy named Khaled. Again, I've turned the sound off. This is for your own benefit because you can just hear some really awful singing from one of the volunteers there. But so his name was Khaled, and we joked that he was DJ Khaled. I was Jessie J. We're going to do a little duet. But he had an incredible story. He was only 20 as well, but he'd crossed over from Libya to Malta, and he got put in a detention centre in Malta for about 7 months. But when he got out, he was living there for a while, and he learnt Maltese. Then he crossed over to Italy, and he learnt Italian. But then he'd made his way here to Calais, and he was so excited to be able to go and learn English. So he used to have Zoom lessons, sort of like English tutoring lessons on his phone every day from within the camp. He introduced me to his tutor, just sort of virtually. And he said his favourite way to learn English was he would get up his favourite music videos that had the lyrics on them, and he loved Ellie Goulding. So he would just be sort of like singing along and sort of like learning the lyrics that way. But his English was already really good considering. Yeah. Then this was another guy, I did not get his name, but I called him the biscuit entrepreneur. So he'd obviously just sort of saved up some rations from different sort of distributions, and he was selling the biscuits within the camp for anyone who had a little biscuit craving, which I thought was really cool. You can just see him there doing a peace sign, smoking a cigarette. This was a great invention. So obviously rats are a huge problem within the camps as well. and people would need to be able to store their food for a little while because we do distribution, say once or twice a week of this food. It needs to keep. So these people, they'd put all of their food inside an old trolley, and they'd strung it up from the roof of one of the old warehouses just to keep it away from the rats. And this was also really cool. So while we were on the sewing station, some of the guys kept coming up and asking for some of the thread, and we were like, "Why do you want that? You don't want the needles or anything?" And they were like, "No, just the thread." And they started threading each other's beards. So you can see here, it's just to kind of like make that line really clean, sort of around the beard, and then around the hairline. They did a couple of volunteers' eyebrows as well. I was a bit scared of that, so I didn't have that done, but a few did. And then this was a really sort of touching moment from my time there as well. So we on the day of Eid, which for those of you who aren't aware, it's a religious holiday in Islam. So it celebrates the end of the month-long fasting period of Ramadan. So we visited Dunkirk, which was mainly Kurdish people, so it had some Muslims there. And we were walking through the camp at one point, and it was just me and this other woman called Rosemary. So she was this 70-year-old volunteer who was in a wheelchair, but she was still there and she was doing her bit. And we were just walking around a part of the camp, and we heard this guy sort of like chasing us, or like following after us. And so we turned around, and he was shaking a kettle, and we didn't really understand what he meant at first, but he was like, come, tea. And he basically invited us, and we followed him all the way back to his camp, and he cleared away in the rubble just so that the Rosemary's wheelchair could get through. And he made space for us around his campfire so that we could sit there. And then we were all just sat there sort of like being there with them for part of their celebration while they were making us tea. And it was just really beautiful. And obviously there was quite a difficult language barrier, so we couldn't communicate that much, but this is just a little snippet of while I was there and just hearing the people singing. So bear in mind that a lot of refugees don't like their faces, don't like photographs of their faces. So that's why you can hear, like, this video, it's mainly sort of like just the situation and like people's feet. You can hear me being like, no faces, so that's just why.
الله أكبر الله أكبر عليه الحمد الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر الله أكبر ولله الحمد بقي بما مصر اللهم لك الشكر
Yeah, so it was a really beautiful moment that Rosemary and I shared, so it was nice. So then a little bit of a background into the UK refugee regime. So it just gives a bit more insight as to how the process works if and when these people do reach the UK. So the UK is party to the 1951 Refugee Convention, so that gives it certain obligations to protect asylum seekers and refugees. A significant number of those who apply for asylum in the UK, they initially face rejection, and then at the border, the government they fast track the process of someone seeking asylum. So that border official, essentially, they're encouraged to reject the claim. That's sort of like tended towards saying no, unless these people are on a specific list of countries that the UK deemed to be unsafe. And then if they are deemed to be, if they're from one of those countries, then there's a whole other process. But unless you're from one of those countries, like, you don't have a chance, essentially. So then a huge majority of those people can then appeal, but unless they're receiving quite good legal advice, a lot of these people don't realize that they should or that they can appeal. Obviously, imagine if you're there and you get your initial claim rejected, so that's probably just kind of going to be completely disheartening, and you wouldn't know that you can appeal that. And then a quarter of those who do appeal, they then receive their status as a refugee. So obviously that means that the tribunal courts, they play a huge role ensuring that the UK adheres to its protection obligations. And that includes that 1951 Convention principle of non-refoulement, that one about not returning people to an unsafe country. So the UK perceptions towards refugees and our responsibility to accept them, they revolve around sort of a combination of this humanitarianism, which is linked to British liberal values, and immigration control agendas, which are centred on the idea that there are bogus claimants that need to be weeded out. So this has created a stigma around these labels of refugee and asylum seeker. According to Respond, which is the organization that this is credited to, their interviews, they've showed that a lot of the actors have internalized those narratives of the bogus, non-genuine refugee, and then that's played into their feelings towards these people. And that stigma has then carried over just into public sentiment towards them, and it's made 1,000 times worse by a lot of derogatory headlines and different labels that you see slung around by the right-wing media. So I presented a lot of the problems. Now, what is the solution to this? Of course, I don't have the answers. No one does. One thing that I do know is that refugee crises, they're a symptom of history. You can't just wave a magic wand and solve all conflicts in the world and stop refugees from needing somewhere to go. It's happened throughout history. It's also not helpful to try and make the journey and the living situation so difficult for refugees, just hoping that that's going to make them disappear. The very nature of the status of a refugee is that they can't go back. So by creating a hostile environment for refugees, both on the border and then when they arrive in the UK, you simply drive people into more destitute, dangerous positions. You give them fewer options to reach safety. So by advocating for better rights, we can ensure that they actually have a safe passage and a fair hearing for their case. So I've told you about my experiences in Calais, some of the things that I learned, but what's next? So if I have managed to inspire you in any way, there are a few things you can do. If you're feeling really passionate and you can make your way to France, you have the opportunity, just as lockdown starts to ease, you could go, you can have your own experiences, connect with people and contribute with Care for Calais. If you can't make it to France, understandably, the organisation always needs people to volunteer in the UK as well. Just things like logistics management, comms, fundraising, and just general admin stuff. A really simple thing that you can do is hold a fundraiser or collect and donate, either as an individual or as an organisation. On the Care for Calais website, there's more guidance about the things that are most in need. But what I want to touch on lastly is that helping refugees is not just about providing aid. Through campaigning, we can speak out against the things that are stopping people escaping war, torture, and persecution in their home countries, and stopping them from reaching the UK to be with their family and to start a new life. So just by helping to be that voice, you can be the change that we'd like to see, both in politics and in society. So thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to either shout out or type them in the chat, or you can just get in contact with me if you want to hear more. If you're interested in doing something similar, I can put you in touch with people from Care for Calais, or literally anything. That's my email, so feel free to take that down. But otherwise, thank you for listening. If there are any questions at all, just holler. So we've got one question. How do you ensure the equitable allocation of resources between refugees, such as food? So that's a really interesting question, and actually it's very well thought out by the people who did sort of the logistics management at the organisation I was with. So it depended on which site we were going to. So for example, at the Calais main camp, because it was mainly single men, they could all they were in good health, they could make it to this distribution site. So we would often say, okay, we're going to have one food pack for 4 people. And so these people, we would ask them to get into groups of 4 with their friends. They would come as a group of 4 and we'd give them one big food pack and they would cook with that together around their campsites. However, for example, when we were in Dunkirk around the camp that was mainly Kurdish families, that became a lot more difficult just because a lot of the families imagine, so you might have like a mother and 5 children who were there around a campsite. You can't ask them all to come to this distribution site to collect a food pack because often they'd be walking, for 40 minutes across like a field. It doesn't really work. So what we would do is we would go around to each of those campsites and we would give them sort of like a ticket, and we would in some way communicate, okay, if you take this ticket and you come to the distribution centre, we will give you 1 food pack. And the way of making sure that was equitable was we would see each of the campsites, we would give them 1 ticket per campsite, and they wouldn't be able to get a food pack unless they had that. And then we would also have quite a rigorous system for making sure that people didn't join the queue twice. So we would try and make sure that everyone got what they needed, but no one was getting it twice. So there was quite a system in place. Trying to see some of the other questions. There's quite a few that popped up. So someone's asked, I thought there was a law that asylum seekers had to stay in the first country in the EU that they stepped in. So I'm really glad that someone brought that up actually, because that's something that people often raise, and it's often a reason that people say, oh, well, if they arrive in the UK, then they're breaking the law. They're not doing it right. They were supposed to stay in the first country they arrived in. Actually, what the law says, and it's quite particular about this, is that is the responsibility of the country, the first country that they arrive in, to process their claim. And if that first country does not process their claim, either because whatever reason, then that refugee is free to then move on. So the responsibility is not with the individual, the responsibility is with the state. And that's a really key thing to remember. Is someone unmuting? Is someone got a question?
I typed my question in the chat. I don't know if you've seen it. I was going to ask how the situation in Calais is going to change after Brexit.
Oh, okay, thank you. To be honest, I'm not sure how or if it necessarily will change, just because that border, like a lot of the people who are crossing over to the UK, often it's sort of through a lot of people that I spoke to, they were traveling through on boats or sort of like under, like in the back of lorries kind of thing, or like under the lorries. And I just think those means of transit are always going to be there, and therefore there will always kind of like be that bottleneck ending up in Calais. So politically, I'm not 100% sure, but I think in terms of like just the situation there, I think it will still exist. I think, like I said, I think refugee crises they do constantly sort of come up, they happen, and this is just one of those natural sites where people have gathered, and I don't think that a political change like Brexit is going to affect that, especially because bear in mind that a lot of the refugees that we spoke to, they're not even aware of Brexit. They don't know what it is. It's not relevant to them, and so Brexit is not going to change the fact that they're still going to end up in that place. That's my interpretation of it. So someone asked, do you think there's a bias against young single males applying for refugee status? So, for example, like countries preferring families, women, and children, cherry picking who gets refugee status. That's difficult to say. I would say you could argue that yes, just because the way that the system works in the UK is that someone arrives at the border, and when their refugee application is being heard, so they have normally it's about an hour and a half to sit down with one border official and tell their story, and you've got an hour and a half to sort of somehow transmit this idea of that you are being persecuted and that you can't go back to your home country. An hour and a half is not very much time, especially considering that border official is encouraged to say no. And I would say an important thing to remember is that this is not a foolproof system in any way, and those border officials are human. And I would say a lot of the time, if people see sort of like a young man who, and like I said, a lot of people I spoke to, they were quite hardened in a way to things that they had seen, because this was just what they'd lived through. So when they're telling their story, they might not necessarily seem very emotional. And to a person who's sitting on the other side of that and listening to that, that doesn't tug on their heartstrings as much as seeing a family or a woman who, you know, a single mother who's escaped war. And so I would say that maybe an unintentional bias might be given towards families and women and children, but they're not supposed to. That's not the way it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be about who is, you know, who is most in need of that.
Hi, Jessie. Just a quick question. I think I wrote it, but is vanished. So no worries, because I know many people ask the question as well. Apart from food, it doesn't seem any plan for proper shelters, because the condition of living over there, you can see from the videos, all of the photos you shared, is not good. So do you have any answer for this, or is there any plan you know about it? Because they need hygiene conditions as well, but it seems there is nothing.
I would say the simple answer for that is that no, there is not a plan for that, because there was that. So when the jungle, as it was known, was there, there were shelters. So that's why in the kind of aerial view that I showed at one point, it's mainly sort of these blue tarps, and they were given sort of like by different organizations, and they're kind of more like established structures. And then there was like a shower block, there was like a water station, just things generally that make things a lot easier for people to live there. But the reason that the camp was cleared and the reason that police continue to come there now is they don't want that permanent settlement. So no, there's no plan to actually make this a more permanent settlement. It's not managed by the UN or anything like that, like other refugee camps are. And sometimes one of the things that we would distribute, our organisation, was tents and different tarpaulins that people could hang up on trees to keep them away from the rain. And we would do that, but the police would still come along and clear them. So that's a really key sort of part of this, is that the authorities don't want this to be permanent. They don't want to make it a comfortable environment for people to live in. And that's why, you know, you can try and sort of like build more concrete structures for people. They're going to be cleared. So those warehouses that you actually saw there, the ones that were kind of like very derelict and abandoned, and people would set up tents inside, obviously so that they were more sheltered, that was about to be demolished. Actually, that was like within the next month, I think, because I left right at the end of May. Within the next month after that, there was a demolition order to come along and clear all of those warehouses, not just clear people out of them, but destroy the whole structures. So it's that extent of like people having literally nowhere else to go. And as much as you can sort of try and give them what they need, it's very much subject to whether that then in 2 days gets cleared by the police.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
It's okay. So apologies if you already talked about this. I missed the beginning. What's the morale like in the camp? As it sounds like the odds are against them. How long does this person spend in the camp on average? So that first part, the morale in the camp, I would say that depended a lot on which camps we were at, because like I said, so they were very distributed. And you could tell, so I would say, for example, in the main Calais camp, which was a mix of nationalities, there was a little bit more tension, because I think people naturally, they just group with people they can identify with and people who they speak the same language as. So people would kind of split off, but they were all coexisting, and there was sometimes it was a bit more tense sometimes, and that was also the camp that was most in need. So those people had come from much poorer backgrounds generally, so where they had arrived in Calais, they generally had absolutely nothing, and so whenever we were distributing something, it was generally a bit more high stakes, I would say. Whereas in some of the other camps, people were generally grouped in, so in Dunkirk, it was pretty much all Kurdish people. In the BMX site, pretty much all Eritreans. People speak the same language. There's a bit more of a sense of sort of community. And then generally, I would say that the morale is pretty good. So I'd say it really just depends. And then how long a person spends in the camp on average, I actually really heard very differing things from different people. So I spoke to the guy, DJ Khaled, that I showed you, the one who was singing Ellie Goulding. He'd arrived 5 days before. And sometimes people get through quite easily and they end up sort of making their way to the UK. Sometimes they don't. I spoke to other people like Issa, the other one you saw, who'd been in Calais for about 6 months. I think the longest I heard was maybe 9 months. It really depends. And it also depends on how much money these people have. So if they've got enough money to pay a smuggler to get them to the UK, they often had much better chances of getting there, and therefore they'd be in Calais for less time. But if they didn't have as much money, it was often a case of every single night making their way down to the ferry ports, trying to find somewhere that they could hide to get across. And most often they would get caught and then they'd be sent back. And so, you know, for those people, it's kind of like a case of trying and trying and trying, but never quite making it across. And therefore they'd be there for a lot longer. So it just depends on a whole host of things, really. Someone asked, how do some asylum seekers manage to get refugee status while others seem to be left? Again, I think that's kind of links back to what I said about you having that hour and a half with a border official to try and tell your story. It's so subjective to try and convince someone that you have. So part of the legal refugee definition is that saying that you have a well-founded fear of being persecuted. And so someone has to believe that your fear is well-founded. And what does that even mean? It's just so subjective and really, and obviously most of these people who are coming here, they have no idea what the refugee definition is. They don't know what they're trying to prove. They just know that they've come from somewhere where they don't want to go back and they can't go back. So to try and sort of like hit all of those little tick boxes that make someone go, yeah, okay, you're good, you can have the status, it's impossible. It's very difficult, which is why so many get rejected the first time around. Yeah, and someone's raised that only a few make it there if they escape from drowning in the sea or are murdered on the way. Exactly. So people are sort of crossing in really, really dangerous routes. And that's exactly it. By trying to sort of make the environment and the journey as hostile as you can, all you're doing is putting people in more danger. People are still going to come, because sort of the point of being, you know, part of that refugee status is that they can't go back to these countries where they're fleeing persecution or war. They can't stay in the countries sort of often, you know, neighboring those, because there just aren't the resources. So, you know, it just means that people are pushed into like far, far less safe sort of monitored means. So is it actually necessary that the country an asylum seeker is coming from to be announced officially as a country with political issues in order to for refugee status to be granted? Some of the countries listed in the presentation are officially safe countries. Yeah, so again, that's a very subjective thing, and I think it also depends very much on the individual, because an individual might come from a safe country. But so, for example, if any of you heard Shrouk's presentation yesterday, she was saying one of the reasons that she didn't want to go back to her country was because she would be persecuted on the basis of her sexual orientation. And so that's a key thing. So like in some countries, you know, whatever your individual background is, or whatever your case is, in some countries that might be sort of okay, in some countries it might not. And so I think it just really depends on the individual case there. So yeah, you might come from like a safe country, but certain things might have happened to you. You might be persecuted by the state because you're, even though it's safe, you're speaking out against them in a way that means that you are in danger, you know, things like that. So I think, yeah, it's not all down to just the country that you come from, therefore you're on one list or another. It's just that when you arrive in a country, when you arrive in the UK, if you're from a safe country, you're immediately rejected, and it's only then that you can appeal. Where if you're from an unsafe country, you're not necessarily immediately approved, but they'll look into it more. That's kind of the way that it works in the UK. Are there any more questions anyone's got? I'm not sure if I've missed any with all the messages that are being typed, but feel free to shout if I have. That might be just about everything then, and we're just past 4 o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate you taking time out for your Friday afternoon to come and listen to this. I appreciate it's a little deep, but it is real. It's what's going on. And yeah, as I said, feel free to get in contact. My email's there, or contact Ellen, who organised this, and she'll put you in contact with me. If you've got any more questions, or you're interested in doing something similar, or literally anything at all, please do get in contact. But yeah, thank you so much for joining, everyone. Have great weekends. Bye.